Hello, I'm Epictetus. Welcome back to my channel. Today we're looking at a video from the Veritas Forum titled The Resurrection of Jesus, Fact or Ancient Fiction? And they're interviewing Professor N.T. Wright. Professor Wright was the Bishop of Durham in the UK and is now a research professor that is, of New Testament studies at the University of St Andrews. So you might think, what better person to talk about the historical evidence for the resurrection? However, as you'll see, I don't make it very far before I realise that Professor Wright isn't talking from an historical perspective. Rather, what we get is a fairly bland form of apologetics without much reference to any historical method. Let's see how we get along.
There is something surprising and very bold at the heart of Christianity, the claim that Jesus rose from the dead. Say more about that. Suppose somebody says, look, give me a break. That doesn't happen. I gather at one recent debate on this, someone brought in a nurse who had said, listen, you've been in hospitals, you've seen people die. Have they ever come back? And so on. And so how do you respond to the initial skepticism that someone may have of, how could that possibly be?
Well, the first thing to say is that people in the first century knew just as well as we do that dead people don't come back. If you read from Homer through Socrates to Plato to Pliny, whenever they mention the possibility of resurrection, they say, come on, as you say, give me a break. We know that doesn't.
So that's not true. The ancient world is full of stories about people being reincarnated. Just to take the list that he's given there, he says from Homer to Socrates to Plato to Pliny. I'm going to charitably say he's talking about the works traditionally attributed to Homer. In the Odyssey, we are given the story of Castor and Pollux, who after their death are given alternating reincarnation. So one day one's alive, the next day the other's alive. So technically they're reincarnated every other day. Socrates, we don't actually have any writings from Socrates, so how we would read Socrates, I don't know. Plato, in Plato's Symposium, we're given a comparison between Alcestis, who is reincarnated due to her burning passion, her love for her partner, and this is described as pure and a true reincarnation, and this is contrasted with Orpheus, who is given sort of impure half reincarnation because he did it due to vanity. Finally, he moves on to Pliny. Pliny, as far as I can find, doesn't mention reincarnation in any of his writings. However, to use as an example of a person who thought really hard-headedly about the world, let's give a few examples of what Pliny wrote about. He talks about peoples in the far north who have one eye in the centre of their forehead and are in a continuous battle against the griffins. In the Far East, he talks about a people whose feet are turned backwards on their legs and could run backwards at extreme speeds. In the area that's now modern Turkey, he described a people whose spittle could cure snake bites. In Africa, he described a people who were androgynians, who were half male, half female. They had a female breast on one side and a male chest on the other side, and could perform the duties of both sexes. In India, he described a group of men who could live 200 years. And finally, and most impressively, King Pyrrhus's big toe he describes as being, by touch, a cure for inflammation of the spleen. And when Pyrrhus was cremated, that big toe would not burn, and therefore is still, to his day, kept in a box. Suffice it to say that none of these individuals would say, come off it, people don't come back from the dead. It's fairer to say that ancient people believed in some pretty weird stuff and pretty outlandish stuff, and the idea of one dude coming back from the dead would not have been completely unheard of for them.
And the early Christians knew that just as well as we do. This is, again, part of this chronological snobbery thing. And this is a C.S. Lewis line about that. He says, people often imagine that the ancients didn't know the laws of nature and that we now that we have modern science, we do.
It's not chronological snobbery to say that the ancients thought about the world in a very different way to how we think about the world. And the idea that there are impermeable laws of nature is a very modern way of thinking about the world, and not one that really would have come to mind for an ancient person.
And he said, apropos the virgin birth, the reason that Joseph was worried about Mary's pregnancy was not because he didn't know where babies came from, but because he did.
The ancients were aware that babies generally came from coitus and dead people generally remained dead. What's your point?
And the same with the resurrection. The disciples were not going around saying, "Oh, well, isn't that interesting? So people sometimes come back from the dead." No, this was not one instance of what now appeared to be a new possible general rule or something. Far from it.
I mean, to an extent that's true, but if the gospel writers are to be taken seriously, and I think Professor Wright would wish them to be, then this wouldn't even be the first person the disciples had seen come back from the dead. Just remember that Jesus had already brought several people back from the dead by the time of his death, most famously Lazarus and the daughter of Jairus. And then to add to that, in Matthew 27, following Jesus' death, a bunch of people get up out of their graves and visit people in Jerusalem. So at that point, we're supposed to believe that it is quite common for people to come back from the dead.
Rather, and this is a place where people often get confused. As people say, "Oh, well, the Jews believed in resurrection, so when Jesus died, they naturally thought he'd come back." Well, no, some Jews, most Jews of the time, did believe in resurrection, but resurrection, they believed, was something that God would do for all his people at the end of time. Nobody ever imagined it would happen for one person in the middle.
Professor Wright doesn't seem to know his Old Testament very well. In 1 Kings, Elijah prays and God raises a young boy from the dead. In 2 Kings, Elisha raises the son of the woman of Shunem. And then after Elisha's death, a man who's thrown into Elisha's tomb is resurrected upon touching Elisha's corpse. So for a group that had never considered that people might be resurrected before the end times, they certainly seem to write about it.
And you can test this because we know 100 years either side of Jesus, we know of several Jewish resistance movements, messianic movements, rebel movements. Routinely, they ended with the death of the founder. And we have in the histories of Josephus and so on, accounts of what happened next. If the man you followed, who you believe is the king, the new leader, the one God has sent, etc. If he gets killed, you have a choice. Either you give up the movement or you get yourself another leader. And we've got evidence of movements that do one or other of those things. In no case do we have people going around saying, "Actually, I think he's been raised from the dead."
Yes, the claims made about different messianic leaders were different. That gets us no closer to proving that the first century Jews did not or could not believe in resurrection.
Because, they were more hard-headed than that. Life is real, we've got to get on with it. And in particular, the idea of choosing another leader, the leader of the church in Jerusalem throughout the next generation was James, who was Jesus' own brother. Now, it's very interesting because he was a great leader, a great teacher, a wonderful man of prayer, etc. But nobody ever said that James was the Messiah. If Jesus' body had stayed in the tomb, that would have been the natural thing. Well, it wasn't Jesus, too bad, but here's his brother. He's a great teacher. We revere him. And he was the man who was physically closest to this Jesus who sadly got crucified. So that would have exalted James.
Why would that follow? Messianic cults in the first century didn't, after their Messiah died, just cast about for the next person to put the Messiah hat on. There's no reason to believe that's what would have happened or that's what should have happened. Can you show an example of that happening?
But they didn't. They called James the brother of Jesus, the brother of the Messiah. And so as a historian,
He's not an historian. He's an Anglican bishop and a theologian who is now a scholar of the New Testament. No historian can work on a text that they presume to be true prima facie. That is, before they've actually analysed the truth of it. That is no way to do history, and if you do it that way, you are not an historian.
I am forced to say, when I look at the rise of early Christianity and why it took the shape it did, there are all sorts of things which make me say, I cannot actually explain how Christianity got going as a renewal movement in Judaism in the first century, and why it took this specific shape, unless they really all did believe that Jesus was really bodily raised from the dead.
This is what I mean. If you can think of no explanation for a religion developing in the way it did, other than with the assumption of a miracle, then what you're doing is not history, it's theology.
And when you say, but why would they believe that? Could this have been a corporate hallucination or whatever? You can look at those arguments, and I've looked at them and I've written about them, and actually that doesn't work either. They knew about hallucinations, they knew about ghosts, they knew about odd, wacky experiences. There's plenty of literature about that in the ancient world, and they weren't so stupid as just to go wafting off on some idea like that.
Okay, two things. So first, the apostles weren't stupid enough to believe that people's stories about the resurrections might be attributable to hallucinations. So if someone suggests to you they've seen someone literally raised from the dead, if you are stupid, you will say, that sounds like a hallucination. If you are smart, you'll go, yep, that definitely happened. That person was definitely raised from the dead. Second, he gave a list of things that the ancients knew about there, which was hallucination, ghosts, and wacky experiences. Now, I don't know about you, but one of these things is not like the others, or it seems so to me. Ghosts don't really belong in the same list as hallucination and wacky experiences. One is a well researched psychological phenomena, hallucination. The other is ghosts, which, let's be honest, don't exist.
This was a very definite thing. He really has been raised from the dead, and that was why they did and said what they did.
I think one of the most remarkable passages is 1 Corinthians 15, when Paul says, look, a lot of the people here have actually witnessed these events. Yeah. There are more than 500 people who witnessed Jesus after his supposed death, and so go talk to them. Some of them have died, but look, a lot of people have, and this was close enough in time that you could still find these people.
Absolutely.
So you see this Corinthians quote being trotted out time and time again by apologists, and they seem to be claiming that what he's saying here is that you can just go and check for yourself. Just ask one of the 500, they'll tell you. The trouble here is that Paul is writing a letter to the Christians of Corinth in Greece, in the Peloponnese. Now, they don't really seem to understand this, but travel was very difficult in the ancient world. Most people never left their town. And those that did from Corinth would presumably be traders on ships. They'd have no reason to go into the interior of Judea. The other thing is, who are these people? Paul doesn't name them. And where are they? Are they in Jerusalem? Are they in Galilee? Are they somewhere along the 100 miles of mountain road that separates the two? We have no way of actually finding any of these individuals. And the interesting thing is, Paul doesn't claim to have found them either. He doesn't actually say, I went and talked to this person, and therefore I know this is true. Or even you can go and talk to them, and this is true. Because he doesn't name them or give any sort of location for them. In fact, the only two names he does give are Peter and James, who, as leaders of this emergent cult, had the most to gain from lying about it. This claim, this set of claims about the people Jesus had appeared to, is made fully in the knowledge that nobody in Corinth would have been able to check.
Absolutely. The passage there in Paul's letters, written probably in 52-3 AD, so roughly 20 years after Jesus' death and resurrection, and Paul is saying, as you say, more than 500, and most of them are still around. And the implication is, go and ask them.
And there it is. Just go and check. Just charter a ship to take you the 2,000 miles round the coast of Asia Minor and down the coast of the Levant to the coast of Judea, then walk 65 miles inland, and you can start searching for one of the unnamed 500 people who saw Jesus. For the average person in Corinth, those 500 people may as well have been on the moon.
But there's another fascinating thing in that same passage, which is kind of interesting negative evidence, because what he's doing there is quoting an official church tradition, which goes like this, that the Messiah died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, that he was buried, he was raised from the third day according to the Scriptures, and was seen by. And then there's a list of people that he was seen by. And he was seen by Peter, by James, by all the apostles, by 500 at once, and last of all, Paul says, by me. And anyone who knows the early Christian stories, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, will say, something's odd about this, because in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John, the first people to see the risen Jesus are the women. Now, what's happened is that in the official church tradition, already the women have been airbrushed out of the account.
So he's got that completely backwards, and it's actually quite embarrassing for a biblical scholar. If he wasn't such a respected member of the Anglican Church, I might suggest he was lying here. One thing that scholars do not disagree on is the order in which these texts were written. They may differ on the exact dates they were written, but we're all fairly sure in what order they were written. And the fact is that Corinthians was written decades before the other works that he's discussing here, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Even with Mark, we're talking probably 20 to 25 years between these two texts. And the thing they don't mention is the 500. So in the generation between Paul's epistles and the writing of Mark and the other Gospels, it is not the women who have been elided, the women who have been removed, that is, but the 500. The Orthodox position in this period, which is the closest one could come to an official church position, although such a thing did not exist, was that women had seen Jesus first and that he only actually appeared to a select few.
Because the early church will have known that women were not regarded as credible witnesses in a law court.
This is called the criteria of embarrassment, which is a so-called historical criterion for deciding the truth of a particular story. The problem is that this is never used in any situation other than by apologists or scholars talking about the resurrection and the appearance of the women in the resurrection story. That's because in general it's just not true. Who are you to say what a first century Hebrew would or would not have found embarrassing? You just don't know. But the specific problem here is that, yes, for sure, women weren't allowed to testify in a court of law, but in all the Gospels apart from Mark, which would have originally ended as soon as the women saw Jesus and ran away, in all the other Gospels, the women immediately go and fetch men to corroborate their story, which is exactly what they would have needed to do to make their story hold up in a court of law. So even in the specific case, it doesn't work here.
And already we have early evidence that people were sneering and saying, this is just a few hysterical women in the half-light of an early morning. You're not going to believe that, are you?
Where's this evidence from? Right, you really need to cite your sources here.
And so already by the early 50s, the official tradition has lost sight of them. But in all four Gospels, and they're quite separate accounts, they're not verbally that similar, even when they're talking about the same thing.
Yeah, apart from the 40-odd% of Luke and the 50-odd% of Matthew that's copied word for word from Mark. Yeah, they're completely separate accounts that don't share very much verbiage. Remember, this guy claimed to be an historian.
The women are front and center. And this is the point that I'm making. You would never, ever, ever have made that up. Either these stories go right back to the beginning, or they are complete crazy fantasies by people later on who are deliberately shooting themselves in the foot in terms of the credibility of the argument.
Yeah, so there's no reason to believe that whatsoever. I'd also note that there's quite a pleasing literary chiasmus with the women being with Jesus when he's crucified, as in being the last people to see him alive, and then being the first people to see him resurrected. This sort of literary device is the kind of thing that historians look out for when they're trying to judge whether an historical text has strayed into literature rather than history.
So that 1 Corinthians 15 is important, but it's important partly as a sort of negative witness, throwing into relief the extraordinary fact that we have these 4 separate accounts.
Absolutely not separate accounts.
In which the women are the first to see him.
A quick reminder that this is a bishop of the Anglican Church and a professor of theology at the University of St Andrews, and it's really quite embarrassing the extent to which he's misrepresented both the text of the Bible and, more importantly, the biblical tradition. This is really basic stuff that he should be getting right. Anyway, if you've enjoyed this commentary, don't forget to like and hit that subscribe button. If you haven't, let me know why in the comments below. As ever, I've been Epic Treatise, and I will see you soon.